Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal-mursaleen. Habibi ilahi al-alameen. Abul Qasim al-Mustafa Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Wa ala ahli baytihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin al-ma'sumin. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Recite with salawat while they figure out the...
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So we've been talking for a few nights about these paradigms, and then I've offered some critiques of those paradigms and some alternates from our Islamic perspective. Again, it's kind of a two-step forward, one step back. But sometimes there are issues that come up in discussions afterwards, or even I think of some things that I need to add to previous discussions. So yesterday, we talked about this paradigm that the majority rules, right? We talked about how that paradigm plays into a lot of our life here, the way we think here, but that is faulty. And there's certain areas of life and certain parts of our way of thinking that we should not subject to the whim of a majority. So we talked about that yesterday. One issue comes up if you think about what we're saying. That especially that verse. There's a verse from the Quran that says, "La tattabi'u in tattabi'u kathiran min alladhina." No, sorry. In tattabi'u kathiran min an-nas yudilluka an sabilillah. If you follow the majority of people, then they'll lead you away from the path of Allah. And then it continues. Right, so that seems to be saying that the majority is always wrong. Right? Never follow the majority, they'll always lead you astray. Now, fast forward to the time of the reappearance of our Imam. Throughout history, we have been in the minority. Right? And we looked at all those verses that confirm that it's the minority who is right. And the majority is generally not thinking, not using their intellect, on the wrong path, all these different things. Right? What does that say about the time when our Imam comes back? Because there, the prophecies and everything that we know about the reappearance of the Imam and his the realization of his purpose and his dreams say that eventually, after much struggle, much effort on the part of the Imam himself, even fighting, warfare, eventually a time will come when all are Muslim. No one is left without having the belief of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Right? So the majority, in fact the totality of people, they won't be perfect people, they'll be like us, fallible as well, except for the Imam, but the very foundation of society will be good, truth, righteousness, Islam, and the guide and the leader of all of them will be the Imam himself. So then what happens? Is the verse no longer applicable, or what? So the end of this verse, don't follow the majority of people because they'll lead you astray. The end of the verse gives us a hint to let us know that there's certain reasons why the majority tends to lead us astray, generally. It says, إِيَّتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. Because the majority of people tend to follow their whims. Right? They tend to conjecture and follow guesswork and say, well, it seems like this, probably it's like this, I feel like this appeals to me, and that's what they follow. Because that's the case with the majority of people, that's why they lead us astray, if we follow them. It's not saying somehow, regardless of whenever there's a majority, the majority is always wrong. That doesn't make sense. There's nothing, that as soon as you become a majority, all of a sudden you're in the wrong. That doesn't make any sense. If you're on the right path, if you happen to win over a majority of people, so be it. You're still right. Right is right. Right? So in the time of the Imam, people will no longer be following their own personal whims and their own conjecture and these sorts of things. They'll have solid guidance in the person of the Imam, and they'll follow that guidance, and the very foundation of society will be truth and righteousness. Right? So that majority rule is you can say it's predominantly the case because of the character of most people. But in that particular case, and even it could be even in the short term, you might find situations, societies, communities where a majority of people are on the right path and doing the right thing. So be it. And that's also possible, and it's not contradicting the verse, which is saying don't follow the majority. In these cases where people are following the right thing, do follow the majority. Be with the majority because that majority is good and they're following a well-founded path. Okay, so that's one clarification from yesterday's discussion. I also mentioned at the end some areas of life where following the majority is okay. It is either a natural thing to do, an okay thing to do. Sometimes it's even a good thing to do. I'm going to clarify that a little bit as well. If you think of the way our government, the U.S. government is founded, the way it kind of gets its legitimacy. It's a government. The Constitution says it's a government is the Constitution or the Declaration? Anyway, it says a government for the people, by the people, and of the people. If I'm not mistaken, it's also there, right? So it's the very legitimacy of the government in a democracy is the will of the people. And if the people don't want it, a majority of people don't want the government or don't want that government, then that government's no longer legitimate. It no longer has the right to rule, unless it wants to become despotic and force the people to accept it. But that's the nature. That's by definition, democracy is a government that is established and is only legitimate insofar as the people, the majority of the people, want it. Now, what about an Islamic government? What is the role of people's opinion and people's vote in an Islamic government? In an Islamic government, legitimacy itself is not dependent on the will of the people. The legitimacy of a proper Islamic ruler, right? Think in the ideal circumstance of the Prophet or an Imam, right? An infallible, God-endowed leader of the community. He doesn't need people to legitimate his position. He's appointed by God, and that's all the authority he needs. For that reason, we say, for instance, that like we know that Imam Ali alayhi salam, even if people didn't recognize him as their Khalifa after the Prophet, he still was, in fact, the Khalifa of Allah. He was, in fact, an Imam. As soon as the Prophet died, his Imamate started and his Khilafah started, and he was he had divine authority, whether or not people recognized it. However, there is a role for the opinion of people and for the will of people in the actualization of an Islamic government. Not the legitimation of the government, but the actualization of the government. Right? So this ruler, in that ideal circumstance where it's a ma'soom, he derives his power from Allah Himself and Allah's authority. However, the nature of Islamic government is that the Islamic ruler does not force himself upon people. It's not the purpose. It's not the purpose and the goal of the Prophet or the Imam to come and become a dictator and say, I have my authority from God. That's all I need. Now you follow me whether you like it or not. And if you don't, then and lay out terms like that, where I'm going to force myself upon you, and you either support me, join my government, or death or banishment or whatever else. That's not the way that they do things, because their goal is not to establish power. Other dictators do that because they can't, for various reasons, they can't get the support of the people, and so they force themselves upon the people. And because their goal is power, their goal is to establish themselves. It could be personal gain or whatever other reason they might have, but that's their goal. Whereas the goal of the infallible guide of Allah is to guide people. He wants people to realize, to educate them, to be educated, to find guidance, and of their own free will to then realize that this is the right path, and then to follow him on that path. right? And that happens not through forcing themselves on them or by the sword and these kinds of things. It happens through, first and foremost, education. Preaching to people and telling them, here, this is what I stand for. This is where I've come from. Here's the proof of what I'm saying. This is why what I'm saying is right. This is what you need to do. Here are my leadership credibilities. Let me show you what we're going to do, how we're going to lay things out. And people realize, or don't realize, but if they are open-minded, they follow him. They realize that what he's saying is perfect, is great. He has miracles to back up to back up the claim that he's from God, and that establishes the actual, or that begins the process of actualization of that government. Right? So the legitimacy comes from Allah and doesn't need people's opinion and people's support, but to actually form a government and to actually begin to rule, they do need the people. Right? I hope that distinction is clear. And so that actually, it helps to make sense of things. If you look back at early Islamic history, how we have Imam Ali alayhi salam, for instance. Imam Hassan, I think, is a very good example for understanding this. So Imam Hassan alayhi salam, he again, his authority comes from Allah, but the actualization of his government, it depends on the support of people. And in the beginning, when Imam Ali is first martyred, and Imam Hassan is given the bay'ah by the people, right? He also has that. He's able to actualize his government and carry on his father's government. Establish a government because he has the support of people. But very quickly, within 6 months or even less than 6 months, Muawiyah is able to undermine that undermine his authority by people over and all sorts of different ways. He's able to destroy that government that Imam Hassan has established. And the end result is that Imam Hassan is forced into this position because of his lack of supporters. He's forced into a position where there's nothing to do except salvage what he can for the sake of the ummah and sign this treaty with Muawiyah, at least putting some checks and balances on him. So at least he's done his part to try to curtail this. So, for instance, one of the conditions was that Muawiyah would not have the power, according to the treaty, to appoint a successor. The Khilafah would come back to Imam Hassan or his successor in the event of Muawiyah's death. Right? But so that was there. Imam Hassan did everything that was in his power to ensure that, at very least, he was able to limit the power of Muawiyah to some extent. But Muawiyah disregards it. He gains more and more power. He literally tramples on the treaty and says, I'm going to disregard all of this. And in fact, also he disregards it. And that's where the whole story of Karbala starts as well. Right? In the middle of Rajab, when Muawiyah dies, he appoints his son Yazid. Yazid sends word to Medina. Before anyone else can learn about his father's death, he wants to make sure that he has Imam Hussein on board or dead. Because that's the only way that he can continue and establish it. So that's a good example to show how the support of people is important for the realization, the actualization of an Islamic government. And without that support of people, Imam Hassan wasn't able to do what he had to do. Not because he had any less authority the day after he signed the treaty versus the day before he signed the treaty with Muawiyah, but only because he now lacked the support to be able to actually have this government and have it functioning. Mm-hmm. Okay, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The paradigm I want to speak about today is, it's a paradigm that it's become kind of a catchphrase as well. The end justifies the means. Right? The end justifies the means. So what that means is, if you have a particular goal in mind, which is the end to which you're working, right? If that end is important enough, if it's important enough to your movement or whatever, then whatever it takes to get there is justifiable. Right? So for instance, if I want to build the center, right? If that's a goal and that's my end, and everyone agrees it's a noble end, then this philosophy of the end justifies the means would legitimate any sort of effort that's necessary in order to achieve that end. So we need money, for instance. That's one of the main ingredients for building the center, right? If I had this sort of philosophy, I would say it doesn't matter whether the source of that money is halal or haram, right? Regardless, because the end is good, even if the means are tainted, no problem, because the end justifies these means. Right, so that's what this philosophy means. This paradigm means the end justifies the means. So this is something that we see all the time right now, right? I'm going to talk a little bit of current events and even recent history a little bit, just to give a lot of examples that we are seeing right before our eyes, where this sort of paradigm is a paradigm that's being implemented by our government, right? We are party to this kind of a philosophy and this paradigm, simply because we belong to this country and we're citizens of this country. So one of the things that is used, one of the applications of this paradigm is, for instance, we have the goal of national security. Right? So think about all the things that are done in the name of national security. Things that our government is doing in order to establish or preserve national security. Right? So torture, for instance. Right? They justify the use of torture, or the euphemism is enhanced interrogation techniques, right? Apparently it's supposed to be a nicer word for torture. That this now, as inhumane, as degrading, as just inhuman even, as it is, and as illegal as it is internationally, it's still justifiable because we have a greater goal in mind, which is to preserve national security. And so since that's such a noble goal, even if we have to break laws, break ethical rules, treat people as less than human, inflict unspeakable pain on people, so be it. Even if we don't get any information from this person, if in general we are able to get some information from some of the people that we torture, then that one piece of information that leads to some sort of kind of actionable effort is a justification for torturing all of these people. Okay, so that's one example that we have. Drone strikes, right? These unmanned aircraft that are used. Think in recent news we've had the numbers. I think there's a difference of opinion even amongst the officials about what the numbers are of innocent people that have been killed by drone strikes, collateral damage they call it, right? In Pakistan it's on the order of hundreds, right? Recently the Pakistani government has kind of copped out and said it was only 18 or 19 or something like that. But on the order of hundreds of civilians who have been killed by drone strikes, which are not, like if one amongst us is a target, that would justify, that one person amongst us would justify killing us all, even if none of us, the rest of us, has anything to do with it, by this sort of philosophy, this paradigm. Because the end, which is killing this one person who is suspected or even that we know to be bad, that end now justifies killing even innocent people. Those are just collateral damage. And then in some cases you end up killing completely innocent people with no targets involved at all, like this lady who was killed recently in Pakistan in her garden with a child nearby. She's incinerated, killed, and her family came to, I think it was Congress or the Senate, to Congress if I remember, and Congress ignored the whole thing. They didn't even attend. Most of Congress was not in attendance when these people came to simply present their case. Just let them know that this is what happened. This is our situation. This is who you killed, and this is our situation now, and this is what your drone strikes are doing to us. A third example is these unbridled surveillance efforts that are in use so much now. Right. So again, national security is the end, and so the means that are employed are all surveillance on anyone, right? With or without justification, without even probable cause. They're allowed to surveil U.S. citizens. Right? Without any probable cause. They can profile us in any which way. And if they even suspect that just for being Muslim or just for whatever else, they can secretly, without even letting us know, surveil us, and that's justified because possibly they'll attain some information from somebody, even in some percent of the cases, and that will somehow justify the means, justify the ends. U.S. mosque, we've seen, right, the NYPD was under scrutiny because they had categorically and kind of indiscriminately decided that mosques were terrorist kind of havens, and so they began surveillance efforts of mosques as organizations and individual Muslims in New York, and that became a huge controversy. But it was justified because of national security. The ends justify the means. And then most recently on foreign allies, right? Even foreign friends, right? It's 35 different world leaders that were recently, it was recently discovered, at least 35 that were recently discovered that NSA was spying on around the world. That's also justified. So even if they're friends, even if they're generally they're political allies, but they're still using these kind of claims to justify their actions. A fourth example of ends justifying the means is the support that we offer, that our government offers for dictators and otherwise oppressive governments. Right. So the same thing goes. Like, we have a rhetoric of freedom and democracy, that's what we're promoting. Right. But it is simply rhetoric because it doesn't pan out. It's conditional. If freedom and democracy happens to serve our purposes, our national security purposes, so be it. If not, that's not a priority. That can be placed aside. We can compromise on that as long as we can satisfy our national security interests, right? And so we end up supporting these different dictatorial governments, Saudi Arabia for one, right? Which is literally like not even by any sort of we're shooting ourselves in the foot kind of directly by supporting a Saudi regime which directly supports Al-Qaeda, these sorts of things, and then comes back and bites us, right? But because it's deemed to be in some sort of interest in some people's minds, that's justifiable, and we support them anyway. Bahrain's this Al Khalifa Hamad, I think is the king's name, right? So Bahrain is also a dictatorship ruling a minority government ruling over a majority of Shia. Right. I mentioned I visited a couple of years ago. I'd gone for Muharram lectures there in Bahrain, and at that time, this was before all of the turmoil, and they were the people I was with. They were mentioning how one of the policies that the local Bahraini government had implemented was to offer citizenship to like Jordanian Sunnis and just people from all over the place. Other people who had nothing to do with Bahrain. If they were Sunni, they were offered citizenship, so the statistics could be shifted. So at least they would give the image of having some sort of parity between the Sunnis and Shias, even though the actual population breakdown was something on the order of 80% Shia to 20% Sunni or something like that. But now they had shifted it over the course of several years to where it was something more like half and half, or like 40-60 or something like that. But they're moving to the point where they wanted to establish, let it be at least seen that we're at least we're Sunnis and Shias, we live side by side, and so we're justified as being a Sunni government, even though there's Shias who are ruling over. But our government supports them, right? They're useful because they house one of our fleets, and they're a good ally and kind of strategically placed, so we can have good sights on Iran and all these different things. So that justifies supporting a dictatorship no matter what they do. Right? If we don't support them directly, we have our Saudi friends to go and support them for us against their majority kind of peaceful protests. We have helped to suppress all those protests because these are not the protests that we want. That voice of the people is not to be heard. It's not strategic for us. So we'll suppress that voice of the people and listen to this dictator instead and support him. And then in Egypt, we saw recently the coup. A democratically elected Mohamed Morsi, right, is no longer seen as being in our own interest or in our ally Israel's interest. And so if a military coup comes and overthrows a democratically elected official, so be it, because that particular kind of democracy or that brand of democracy, that didn't quite suit us, so we oust it and put our ideals aside. All right, one more example. So on this side we support dictators. On the other side we undermine and remove our support from democracies if those democracies are not suited to us. Also in the name of the ends justifying the means. Right. So we have Hamas, for instance, elected to parliamentary elections over the Gaza Strip, and because that was not in Israel's interest or even our interest, so we undermined the authority and kind of play games that the elections were rigged and these sorts of things, and undermine the authority of that government because it's not in our interest. Iranian elections are always do the same thing, right? We always undermine the Iranian elections. The participation that they have in Iran in their elections is much higher than what we have here in America. Like the percentage of people who actually vote over there is much more than what we have over here. So it's more of a democracy, more of a kind of a real democracy where people are actually voting versus America. Right? But we don't accept that, and that particular democracy is not good enough, and so we undermine the authority of that. And finally, Algerian elections back in 1991, I think, right? The parliamentary elections elected. It was like the polls, the predictions were saying that this election is going to lead to an Islamic government, and so a military coup was launched, and the election was stopped, and that democracy was not allowed to even take place. Even to form, because it was heading towards an Islamic government, right? And so we undermined that as well. We supported that, right? So lots and lots of examples of this sort of paradigm of the end justifying the means, and this is standard fare for our government. Okay. All right. So what do we do about this? What is the Islamic kind of standpoint on the paradigm itself? So. This one's a little bit challenging because we can't simply say that the paradigm is wrong. There's a place for this kind of paradigm, but what's wrong with these, particularly in these examples that I've given you, is that the particular end which has been chosen by our government in these examples does not in fact justify the means. No, I should say, yeah, that's right. The end in these particular examples does not justify these means. Right? So either the end is unworthy, or the means are so heinous that they can't be justified by any end. Right? So the problem is not completely in the paradigm, but in kind of accepting this paradigm as absolute. That any end, any end can justify whatever means. If the end is good enough, any means can be justified, no matter how inhuman and heinous. That part of the paradigm, that absolute nature of the paradigm, is wrong. Right. Let me give you some examples and kind of explain it a little bit in more detail. So in Islamic law, we have this concept of tazahum. Let me explain what this concept is. Tazahum is where we have two different duties between which there is some conflict. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples. Like one, for instance, would be if we have a recommendation. This can be with wajib things or mustahab things. So one example would be if there's it's mustahab, it's recommended when you go for hajj or go for umrah at the Kaaba to try to touch the black stone, al-hajr al-aswad, or even to kiss it. Right? It's called istilam. So it's mustahab to do that. That's one duty. It's a recommended duty, not a wajib duty. It's a recommended duty to do that. We have another obligation, which is that it's haram to hurt people for no reason. Right? وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْذُونَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ بِغَيْرِ مَا اكْتَسَبُوا فَقَدْ احْتَمَلُوا بُهْتَانًا وَإِثْمًا مُبِينًا. Those who needlessly and in an unwarranted way torment or bother the believing men and women, then they have earned this tremendous sin with Allah. Okay, so we have these two duties that come into conflict at Hajj al-Aswad, right? Because of or even the darih of our different imams and the Prophet, but the Prophet not so much, because the Sunnis take care, the Wahhabis take care of making sure there are no crowds there. But the darihs of our different imams, right? The same thing. It's definitely it's mustahab to go and to touch it, be close there, and say our prayers there. But it sometimes comes into conflict with this other obligation, which is to make sure that we're not harming people by pushing them or stepping on their feet or these sorts of things in order to get to that objective. Right, so tazahum comes in play here, where there's a conflict between these two duties. And so in cases of tazahum, what we have to do is we have to figure out which of these two conflicting duties, where both of which we cannot fulfill, which of them is more important than the other. Right, so our mujtahid, it's the job of a mujtahid. As lay people, we don't have the data to be able to understand which of these two do. In this case, it's clear, but in many cases, it's not necessarily clear whether choice A is more important or choice B is more important. But in this particular case, the example I gave, certainly the prohibition against hurting people is aham, it's more important than the recommendation to touch the hajar or to touch the darih. And so when there's a conflict, then you have to choose the former and make sure that you're not hurting people. So if that means you can't go and touch the Hajar al-Aswad, so be it. If that means you can't go to the darih, so be it. You can say your ziyarah from further away. You can say your istilam, say Allahu Akbar, and the du'as for Hajar al-Aswad from far away. Right, so that's the concept of tazahum, where you have a conflict and then you resolve it by giving favor to the thing that's more important over the thing that's less important. Another example is which played out a couple of years ago in Saudi Arabia. We have a prohibition, of course, against touching non-mahrams, which we talked about a couple of days ago. But then if someone's life is in danger, someone of the opposite sex who's a non-mahram's life is in danger, and to save their life, to rescue them, you have to touch them. Saving their life is more important than not touching them. Right? If you remember, I don't know how many years ago it was in Saudi Arabia, there was, I think, a girls' school that burnt down, and the Saudi fire brigades who came to the site, they saw that it's all girls there, and then we said Islam prohibits us from touching them, and so they let them be, and all the girls died in the school. They're all burnt to the building. Right? That kind of empty, senseless Islam, where you see a much more, like any common sense standard says that human life is more important than any other standard, right? But these people were blind to that. They got blinded by this standard. They say, oh, we have to be very holy and not touch them, and they let them die, right? But so clearly, tazahum dictates that saving their life is much more important. So even no matter what you have to do, touch them, see them without hijab, whatever you have to do to save their life, that takes precedence over issues of hijab and touching these kinds of things. Yeah, so that's tazahum, which is a way of resolving these conflicts in our fiqh. Okay, so those are some examples. Now, with that kind of background in mind, some ends are so important that they do justify the means, and we can kind of resolve it in the same idea of tazahum and weighing what's more important, what's less important. So, for instance, self-defense, defense of yourself, your dependents, your family, for instance, your household, that's a strong Islamic value. And so if a circumstance comes, God forbid, where, for instance, somebody breaks into your house and they're now threatening you, your life, your property, these sorts of things, right? We have a duty Islamically to do whatever we can to defend ourselves and defend those things around us, right? And so even if it means, for instance, killing the person who's invaded your house, that's justifiable because it's in self-defense. And from an Islamic perspective as well. I'm not talking about from a legal perspective here, but from an Islamic perspective, that's a justifiable killing of this person, or whatever needs to be done, whether it's, you can hit him or hurt him or push him, whatever it is, or even to the extent of killing him, it's justified. That end is justified because, that means is justified because the end, which is preserving the sanctity of your house and defending your life and the life of your children, your family, and your property, is important enough in Islam that it justifies taking the life of this other person. All right. So in this situation, because the end is so sacred, it does justify this particular means. So it's a qualified version of that same paradigm of the end justifying the means. Only in those instances where, from the Sharia itself, we learn that the end is so important, and that the means is less important, right? In that circumstance, then we're able to use that particular means or make that particular trade-off because the ends is that important. But it can't just be kind of willy-nilly the way our government is using it. Another example from our history, if you think of the premium that Islam places on women kind of being private, living a life of where they're private, they're not necessarily in the public eye and coming out in public, right? That's an ideal that Islam has. There are exceptions, and it's not a wajib sort of obligation that they are not allowed to be in public, but it is definitely an ideal, and we see that in the lives of our the women from our Ahlul Bayt. But there are circumstances in history that were so dire, and there's an end that was so important that in those circumstances, some of the women of the Ahlul Bayt did come out in public, and in a very public, vocal way, they denounced the wrongs that were happening. So one great example we have of this is Sayyidatuna Fatima Zahra. So after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, right, we know the tragedy of Fadak. That Fadak was usurped from her in a very dirty sort of a way, right? Which is basically tantamount to saying, for instance, if Brother Naki has a phone, if I come over, I take his phone from him, put it in my pocket, and I say, if you think it's yours, you prove it to me. Right? You prove that the burden of proof is on him to prove that his phone is his, because I've now taken it, it's now in my possession. Right? That's basically what happened to her. Right? They took Fadak from her, expelled her agents who had been there for a good number of years, at least four years from the time of Fadak, which is in the 7th year Hijri, if I'm not mistaken, until the Prophet's death in the 11th. So these 4 years, her agents had been there working, taking income, sending it to her, and all this stuff, administrating it. She was in charge of Fadak for 4 years. And now as soon as the Prophet dies, her agents are kicked out. Abu Bakr puts his agents in. And now when Fatima Zahra says, what's happening, why have you kicked my agents out? He says, if it's yours, prove it to me. The burden of proof is on you. Yeah, and Imam Ali, Fatima Zahra herself, Imam Ali, they all bring this exact same argument. This is the travesty of the law. Yes, we have qa'idatul yad, which says that whoever has possession of something, then the burden of proof is not on him to establish that it's his. Like my phone, which is in my pocket, right? By default, it is mine. If you claim otherwise, you have to prove it, not me. By default, Islamic law says it's my property, it's in my possession. So if anyone claims otherwise, the burden of proof is on him, not on me. Right? So that's correct. That's the right law. But you can't kind of set it up in a way where you first take it from the person and then say the burden of proof is on you to establish it. Right? That's exactly what Abu Bakr did. Right. So this travesty occurred. That, in addition to what happened to Imam Ali at Saqifa Bani Sa'ida, right? And all of those things combined became such a dire situation, such an important situation, that Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha had to come out. The situation, like Imam Ali himself was not able to speak. His legitimacy itself had been undermined by these people, and his voice was taken from him. Imam Hassan and Hussein are very young, and there's no one else to defend the rights of Imam Ali and the right of Fatima Zahra except she herself. So she goes into the mosque of the Prophet where all the prominent Sahaba have gathered, and she rails on them. And she brings them to tears by introducing herself, reminding them of who her father was, the service that he's given, who her husband is, all of the different events, all the different outstanding qualities of these individuals, and then just railing on these people for all the dhulm that they've done to them. And she brings the entire mosque to tears. Right? So that's one instance where the end, which was defense of the Ahlul Bayt, establishment of a proper Islamic government, right? Defending herself as a mazluma, as somebody who's been oppressed by this illegitimate government, right? That end justified this means, which was to go out in public, which is not her wont. We don't have any other record of her coming out in public and having this sort of a public role before this. But she did it because she had to, and she did it wonderfully, perfectly. And then the other great example is from her daughter, following in her mother's footsteps. Right? Sayyidah Zainab, in the courts of Ibn Ziyad and also in the court of Yazid, she fulfills the same sort of role. Right? The men have been killed. Imam Sajjad is there, but he's the one in question. He's the one who's being attacked, and so she puts herself on the line. She rises up to the challenge, and she speaks publicly, and again silences any opposition. Speaks to Ibn Ziyad and Yazid the way they deserve to be spoken to, with absolutely no sort of respect, and speaks the truth without any sort of fear. Right, so those are two great examples that we have of this kind of this paradigm being used correctly, where certain ends are so important that they justify means that would otherwise not be acceptable or ideal. Imam Hussein himself is another great example. So we have certainly the sanctity of life is very important, and if you remember, it's a long time ago, but the discussion that we had last time I was here in 2006, 6 I think, about enjoining good and forbidding evil. Right? One of the things that we learned in that discussion is that there are certain prerequisites that have to be fulfilled before enjoining good and forbidding evil is obligatory on us. Right? So it's not that, in any instance you're doing something wrong that I now come and start yelling at you because you're doing something wrong. That's not the way. There are certain prerequisites have to be fulfilled, and then there's certain techniques and methods that have to be employed in order to right this wrong. So one of the prerequisites that's there is that there shouldn't. Well, there are many. So one is, for instance, that you have to have knowledge of what you're talking about. Right? If I don't even know exactly what the ruling is and what the rules are for what you're doing, and I'm not exactly sure if what you're doing is wrong, then that's not the place for me to come and start talking to you about how wrong you are, because I don't even know if you're wrong. I don't even know exactly what all the rules are. Right? So knowledge is one of the prerequisites. One of the prerequisites is that you entertain the possibility, a reasonable possibility, that the person will listen to you. If you have a history with this person, or you know this person, he doesn't listen to anything. She doesn't listen to anything. Right? And you know for a fact that as soon as you say anything, they're just going to either turn it back at you or roll their eyes or something like that. Then you don't need to waste your breath on that person. Right? One of the conditions is that you as the enjoiner or the forbidder, you feel safe from harm. We're not required to put ourselves in harm's way in order to fulfill the obligation of enjoining good and forbidding evil. Right? So if there comes a time when speaking up is now dangerous to me, then I don't need to do it. I don't have to do it. The duty is lifted from me. That's the rule. But there are certain circumstances. If you remember Imam Hussein, one of his statements when he gives his statement of purpose, I believe it's in a conversation with Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, his brother. He says that my purpose is not certain things. Right? Lam akhruj batiran wala ashiran wala zaliman wala he mentions several other adjectives. These are not my goals. My objective is to enjoin good and forbid evil. Right? So that's one of his stated duties. That was the reason why we discussed it in 2006. But clearly, his role as an enjoiner of good and a forbidder of evil leads to his death, right? Which is significant harm. So what's happening there? Why did he carry through with this duty, or why did he carry through with enjoining and forbidding when it wasn't apparently required of him? The rule that we have on the book says if you're going to face harm in the process of enjoining and forbidding, then you don't need to enjoin and forbid. It's not required of you. Right? So the solution to this is that there are certain evils or certain goods that are so important that if they are not enjoined or not forbidden, then, for instance, Islam itself will be wiped away. Right? When the life and the welfare of Islam itself is at stake, that's an end that's so significant that it justifies death. Right? Jihad is the same way. Right? Jihad is certainly you're putting yourself in the position of very, very likely dying. But because in the correct sense of the word, a properly waged jihad is done by an imam or by somebody who knows what the true goals, what the true ideals are, who has the correct vision in mind and determines that the only way to attain that vision or defend this particular enemy or whatever it is to wage war. Right? Because all that's there, it becomes such an important service to Islam itself that it justifies even putting yourself in harm's way and in the position of very likely dying. Right, so that's what another good example of an end being so important that it justifies the means of actually offering himself as a sacrifice, and then his companions and his family as well. One last example I want to discuss, I'll do it very briefly, is taqiyya. Because taqiyya is another important part of Islamic law and Islamic principles that we can justify and understand through the same modified version of the paradigm. Okay, so just keep focus on our discussion as well. We're talking about the paradigm of the end justifying the means. I said it's not an absolute thing in Islam. Rather, it's in a qualified way under certain circumstances. There's certain ends that are so important that they justify the means. In the cases of taqiyya, the same principle comes into play. Right, so taqiyya is this idea that we're able to protect ourselves against danger by sometimes doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, right, in order to protect ourselves or people around us from harm. Right? So the classic examples that we have, one is from Ammar bin Yasir's time. Right? So Ammar, and when he was being tortured by the Banu Makhzum, his own tribe, his mother was killed, his father was killed, and he was being tortured. And at one point it became so intense, that torture became so intense for him that he ended up speaking and saying, fine, I renounce it. I renounce the Prophet. Right? So on his tongue he said that. Certainly in his heart he hadn't lost anything. But he just said it just to relieve himself of the pain. And immediately, once he's released because of that, he goes to the Prophet, apologizes, weeps and apologizes, and says, the pain was just too much and I had to say it, but I didn't believe that for a second. Of course I'm still with you. And the Prophet says, you did absolutely the right thing. If they ever do the same thing to you, if you're ever in the same position, do the exact same thing again. What you did was perfectly right. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. There's no sense in giving your life up for that sort of a thing. Say whatever you have to say to get out of the situation, to save your life, and as long as your faith is solid in your heart, that's all that's important. Another good example is, I'm sure it's a story that you know, is from the time of Imam Kadhim alayhi salam. Right, he had there was an advisor in the Abbasid government by the name of Ali ibn Yaqtin. Right, so in Kitab al-Irshad, Sheikh al-Mufid narrates the story. He says that Ali ibn Yaqtin, he writes to the Imam asking him some questions about the wudu, and the Imam responds to him and says to do wudu in this particular way. You wash your face with both hands, and you wash your arms like this, and he describes exactly how Sunnis do wudu and says this is how you do wudu. And so Ali, knowing who the Imam is, he does wudu exactly that way. And at that same time, the goings on in the court. He's I would assume he's in Baghdad, and then the Imam's in Medina. Or maybe that's mistaken, because Imam Khalid spent his time in Baghdad as well, or house arrest, but whatever the situation, he does this, and at the same time Harun al-Rashid is suspicious of Ali ibn Yaqtin, because certain people have suggested that it looks like his loyalties are doubtful. He looks like he's one of the followers of this Ahl Bayt, right? And so Harun al-Rashid, he doubts it, but he says, well, just to check, I'll spy on him. And so at the time of prayer, at the time of wudu, he somehow is able to spy from a window on Ali ibn Yaqtin to see how he does wudu, and he does wudu perfectly like a very good Sunni, and he laughs. I think he actually ends up punishing the person who accused him for his false accusation against Ali ibn Yaqtin. And then once that whole episode is done, and Harun al-Rashid's confidence in Ali is re-established, the Imam sends another letter and says, now this is the way to do wudu. And he shows him the right way. Right, so that's another instance of taqiyya, where even though this is the wrong way to do wudu, and under normal circumstances that would your prayers would not be acceptable if you did wudu like that, but under these extenuating circumstances, for the sake of life, for one thing, but in his position even more important, because he had a very important position in the government. He was an insider, able to help the Shia from the inside against this incredible zalim. It was even doubly, more important that his life be saved. And prayer and wudu is something that can be sacrificed for the greater purpose, which is life itself and the welfare of the Shia. Right? We have lots of examples of that happening, where the Imams would tell companions, tell different people different answers, wrong answers sometimes, wrong interpretations of verses of the Quran, wrong ways of doing things, so for this purpose. But it's sometimes more complicated, but this is the general purpose of that. So taqiyya then, the circumstances of taqiyya and the preservation of one's own life and safety is an end that justifies acting wrongly in cases and speaking wrongly in order to save your life and save your safety. Okay. Any questions, clarifications? Go ahead, I'll repeat the question.
You mentioned that Sayyid Fatima alayhi salam did not go out except in that occasion. I remember reading something that during the Prophet time, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, she went out with other women to the battlefield to attend to the women.
So what I said is not that she didn't go out of the house or just didn't go out at all, but this public role, coming out in public here, giving a speech in front of a mixed all men. In fact, that was a gathering of all men. That kind of a role is not something that we have any precedent for in her lifetime. That doesn't mean that she was secluded in her house and she never saw the light of day. Any other questions on the sister side? Go ahead. Alaikum salam.
I'm sure there's a lot of depth to the topic of Amr al-Ma'ruf that you were discussing that I don't understand. But so you said one of the prerequisites is for it not to harm yourself, your property, etc. So what about the duty that we have to use, at the very least, for example, use our tongues to speak out against something? That could be considered a form of Amr bil-Ma'ruf.
Yes.
And should you hold your tongue because, let's say if it's a political matter, you could get confiscated for it? Could you shed light on that scenario?
Yeah, so she's asking about that condition of not facing harm. If you face harm, then enjoining good and forbidding evil is not obligatory on you. So that's absolutely the case. You have to evaluate the situation. And if enjoining good and forbidding evil is going to entail any personal harm to you, then it's not obligatory on you, unless the cause itself is something so important that it must be dealt with. And that's not for us to determine. That would be the call of a mujtahid, somebody, or at least a scholar who understands kind of what are the stakes here, and is this something that's important enough to warrant that? Only then would it be required.
But doesn't that put Islam into a standstill if the Ummah? I'm not questioning this idea, but if the Ummah thought that way and acted that way all the time, how will revolutions take place? How will change come about?
Yeah. So those revolutions and things that have to take place, overthrowing the governments, these kinds of things, those have to be done with a lot of thought. It's not supposed to be something that the individual people, without really understanding the consequences and the depths of things, that they just say, this seems like it's pretty important, let's give our life for it. Right? When it comes to giving life and facing harm and these kinds of things, it needs to be something truly important enough to warrant the giving of human life for it. And to make that determination, we need our mujtahids on board. They need to see the situation and say, yes, this warrants that. That's the key. And if we lack that infrastructure of mujtahids here locally, that's our fault. We need to fill that void. We need our best and brightest to go forward and fill that void. We need organically to produce these scholars who are steeped in knowledge of Islam, who can come back here, so that we can have people on the ground who understand the situation. Let's do one more question. I think the time is going. So,
If you don't mind, could I ask a question about yesterday's paradigm?
Yeah.
Paradigm you mentioned was, of course, not
Majority
getting into
rules.
majority rules.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that in order to sway public opinion, we're encouraged to participate in democratic processes like elections. Were you referring to national elections equally to local elections?
Yeah, all these elections are we are allowed to and even encouraged to participate in this process here.
But we're given the illusion that we have two choices, right? So
That's another problem. I mean, that's not a problem with Islam or our involvement. That's a problem with the political system here. That's a fault of the system here. That needs to, and I think even here we realize that's a problem, and people are trying to change that with independent parties and these kinds of things. So that's a separate issue. But that doesn't mean that we can't be part of the process. Right? That's only one part of the process. We kind of just characterize it as voting. That's it. Right? It can be a more involved, a continuous process of just figuring out the system and using the system, and working through the system to push our particular interests. Right? That's a more continuous process than simply voting. Right? It takes people who have that interest and have those motives. There are people who have, with anything, there are people who have interests and people who have strengths and skills. Right? They're the ones who have to lead that kind of a cause within our community. But we should at least all be aware that is possible, and that if there's someone who can do it, we should encourage them, help them, and then support them in that effort. It's important for our community. Okay, let me share some stories from Karbala with you. There's one hadith I wanted to share from Nafas al-Mahmoon. Imam al-Rida alayhi salam says, من تذكر مصابنا وبكى لما ارتكب منا كان معنا في درجتنا يوم القيامة. Imam al-Rida says that anyone who remembers the hardships that befell us and cries for what was perpetrated against us, he or she shall be with us at our level on the Day of Judgment. وَمَنْ ذُكِّرَ بِمُصَابِنَا فَبَكَى وَأَبْكَى لَمْ تَبْكِ عَيْنُهُ يَوْمَ تَبْكِ الْعُيُونُ. So the first one was actually actively remembering, right? So if you yourself, just sit down and just think about the story for 5 minutes during the day. Right, you have some quiet time. You kind of think about something. You just think about the story for a little bit. That will qualify. You sit down. You read a maqtal. You read a little bit, or even nowadays you watch some of these films. Like the Mukhtar Nama, the film on Mukhtar. The clips from that are amazing. Maybe you already do that, but if you haven't done that, find those clips on different YouTube and stuff like that. And those clips of the maqtals of the different companions of the Imam and the Imam himself are so powerful. Right? It really brings the whole event to life. That counts as this too. You're doing the dhikr of the Imam, you're remembering his musibah. The second, he says, وَمَنْ ذُكِّرَ بِمُصَابِنَا. If you don't actively do it yourself, but someone else mentions it, you just sit and listen. Right? Somebody else reminds you of the musibah of the Imams, Ahlul Bayt in general, he's saying. فَبَكَى وَأَبْكَى لَمْ تَبْكِ عَيْنُهُ يَوْمَ تَبْكِ الْعُيُونُ. And because of this, she ends up crying. Then on the Day of Judgment, when other eyes are crying, his eyes won't have any reason to cry. He'll be protected from the torture of the Day of Judgment. Third, وَمَنْ جَلَسَ مَجْلِسًا يُحْيَى فِيهِ أَمْرُنَا لَمْ يَمُتْ قَلْبُهُ يَوْمَ تَمُوتُ الْقُلُوبُ. Right? Not even actively doing the remembering, or even necessarily listening, but you're simply sitting in this majlis. And you sit in a majlis where the memory of the Ahlul Bayt is being remembered and kept alive, even that qualifies us for this reward. He says, "Lam yamut qalbuhu yawma tamutul qulub." On the day when out of sheer fear of the events of the Day of Judgment, people's hearts stop. They die. His heart and her heart will not die because they participate in these majalis. Right? These real institution building ahadith, the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, which have led to what we have now. It's a direct result of their efforts in getting us here. The story I want to share with you is the one of Habib ibn Mudahir. It's Mudahir, not Madahir, but Mudahir and Zuhair ibn Qayn. Habib ibn Mudahir was a companion of the Prophet and of Ali ibn Abi Talib, Imam Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, all four of them. When Ali moved his capital from Medina to Kufa, Habib settled in Kufa and fought with Ali in his 3 wars. Right, so this is someone who's committed. He could have stayed in Medina and let the Imam go, but when the Imam moved, he also moved to be right there with him. Habib settled in Kufa and fought with Ali in all 3 wars. He was a hafid of the Quran and was known to read the entire Quran in a single night. Right, that was a habit of his, not simply a one-time thing, but it was a habit of his to recite the entire Quran from memory in a single night. He was one of the few chosen by Ali to learn the secrets of death and affliction, such that he knew how and when he and others would die and what afflictions they would be subjected to. There were just a handful of these companions of the first Imam Ali who were so special that they were given this special knowledge of when they will die. Like most of us, it would change our choices and change how we are, but these people were so special, even though they knew when they would die and how they would die, it didn't change them for a second. Like Mitham Tammar, Abu Dhar al-Ghafari, and Habib al-Mudahir, and other people like that, they were like this. When Muslim bin Aqil arrived in Kufa, Habib and Muslim bin Awsaja accepted the Kufans' pledges of allegiance on his behalf. But when Ibn Ziyad seized control of Kufa, they went into hiding until they heard that Al-Hussein had been detained at Karbala. It was then that they stole out of Kufa to join him. Habib was 75 years old on the day of Ashura. Right, others were imprisoned. Those who had written letters, these had also written letters to Imam Hussein. Others had been imprisoned and weren't able to come out, but they found a way. They escaped and they found a way out of Kufa and onto the battlefield. Despite his age, he is reported to have killed 62 Kufan soldiers. Then Badil ibn Suraym attacked him and struck him with his sword. Another soldier from Tamim stabbed him with a lance. At this, Habib fell to the ground. And as he tried to rise, Al-Husayn ibn Numayr struck him on his head with his sword, at which he fell on his face. There the Tamimi soldier severed his head. Habib's death was hard on Al-Husayn, and his grief was apparent on his face. He called out, "You have done well, Habib. You are an outstanding man. You used to finish the entire Quran in a single night." At seeing the Imam's grief, Zuhair bin Qayn approached him and said, "May my mother and father be your ransom, O son of God's messenger. What is this broken spirit I see on your face? Do you not think we are fighting for truth?" Imam Hussein replied, "Of course, by the God of creation, I most assuredly know with certainty that you and I are with truth and guidance." Zuhair said, "Then let us not worry, for we are heading toward paradise and its blessings." At this, Zuhair stood in front of Al-Hussein and solemnly requested permission to fight. It was granted. He fought fiercely until he had killed 50 horsemen. In the heat of battle, he realized that the time for prayer was approaching. He rushed back to Al-Hussein and said, "Master, I was afraid I would miss the prayer. Please lead us in prayer." It is reported that Abu Thumama as-Sa'idi came to the Imam and made a similar request to pray one last prayer together. The Imam said, "You have remembered the prayer. May Allah raise you among the devotees of the prayer and with those who are always aware of Allah. Yes, it is the beginning of Dhuhr time." Imam Hussein's small force prepared itself for Salatul Khawf. He posted Zuhair bin Qayn and Sa'id ibn Abdullah al-Hanafi in front of the congregation to guard against a frontal attack. As they began the prayer, the Kufan army sent a barrage of arrows upon them. Sa'id ibn Abdullah took these arrows in his attempt to save al-Hussein's life. As the congregation finished his prayers, Sa'id fell to the ground with 13 arrows in his body. His dying words were, "O Allah, curse these people as you cursed Ad and Thamud, and convey my salam to your Prophet, and tell him what pain I suffered. For my sole desire is that, my sole desire in that was to procure your reward by defending the progeny of your Prophet." Then he turned to Imam Hussein and asked, "Did I fulfill my duty, O son of God's messenger?" Hussein said, "Yes, you shall reach paradise before me." Allah la'natullahi ala al-qawm al-zalimin. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bi fina'ik. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين.
Ya Hussein. Ya Hussein. Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein.
Ya
Ya Hussein.
Hussein. Ya Hussein. Ya Hussein.